It's Primus Tracks with Josh and Frankie.
What a couple of dumb shits. Hello, Primates! Primus fans of all ages, Primus fans, hey, you don't have to like fishing to enjoy this podcast. You found Primus Tracks, by the way. Congratulations! I am Josh. Right over there is Frankie. Hi, Frankie.
Hi, Josh.
You're just over there minding your business, swimming around. Good for you, man.
Yeah. Urgent to spawn.
Oh, well, that's a little too much. So we also have with us, it's his third appearance, and I was telling him before we pressed the record button, he is the world champion at guest appearances on Primus Tracks. We're just so happy to welcome back Anthony Garcia. Hello, Anthony.
Ahoy.
We're going to get into it later, but just get this first look at our track today, the Ol Diamondback Sturgeon. When I dropped you an email, this is the track you wanted to talk about. So what drew you to this track initially?
It's kind of like a gut reaction in a way. I kind of thought in my head of all the songs on Pork Soda, and this one, it just felt right.
You're doing the old-fashioned tease there, so we have to listen on to find out more.
Yes. There's a lot of really cool instrumentation, some effects going on, and it's a very kind of not an overly dynamic song in terms of where it goes, but it still feels like you're on a journey. It's got a lot to it.
Oh, man. Well, let's run right through all of our other stuff so we can get to it. I'm excited to talk about this track, too. This is quite a special track in the Primus canon. So first things first, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or tag us in a 5-star post of a sort on Instagram, and you can join the Punch Bowl, quite an exclusive club. You get all kinds of wonderful perks when you show up at the Punch Bowl. Fresh towels, of course, access to the sauna, I believe half-price snacks, and, of course, if you go to a Primus show and you can find Frankie, he will buy you a beverage. At least that's what I'm telling people. Anthony, I'm going to let you try that first, and you can report back to us whenever live music happens again. Thanks. No 5-star reviews to read today. Hey, that's all right. Not much to report in miscellaneous debris either. The bass freaks, though, man, those bass guitar freaks came out of the woodwork for that episode. A lot of talk about what was going on with the bass guitar, thanks to Matt. Bass players all over the place just going, whoa, hey, whoa, I love this track, and so on and so forth. And if you loved that one, you're going to love next week's episode too, when Luis comes back for Nature Boy. And I was listening to that track a little bit of ahead time to get a feel for it. There's some gnarly stuff going on in that track, so we're looking forward to that one from a bass perspective too. But today, we are talking about Pork Soda Track 6, the Ol Diamondback Sturgeon, with the parenthetical, Fisherman's Chronicles Part 3. Before we get into the track itself, not too much of a live history, but I think it's kind of varied. So I'm going to toss it over to Frankie, get us going on the live history of this very interesting track.
A very interesting track indeed, Josh, with an interesting live history as well. It premiered in 1993 at the Thunderbird Stadium in Vancouver, a notable show because it's also the one that had Welcome to This World. After that, there are a few performances in 1993. Not a whole lot. And then some performances in 1994 while Primus was supporting Rush in the Counterparts tour. After that, it completely disappeared from setlists until 2000 when it made a surprise return, but not actually performed by Primus. It actually became a Frog Brigade number. You know, it's notable because it was performed at the first ever Frog Brigade concert, which took place at Angels Camp, California, at the Calaveras County Fairground, Mount Air Festival. So this is back in 2000, is the first Frog Brigade show, and they actually had 2 drummers for this show. They had Jack Irons and Tim Alexander at the same time. After that, there are a few more Frog Brigade performances. Again, not a whole lot. And then it wouldn't appear again until 2003 for Tour de Fromage, with a handful of performances in 2003, and then very few performances in 2004 for Hallucinogenetics. As you know, after that, it would vanish completely from setlists until New Year's Eve 2015 at the Fox Theater in Oakland. And it hasn't been performed again since. So I would say that this track is as rare as DMV.
It's pretty close. Our friends over at Toasterland have it at 40 live performances, although some of those are probably teases, and they're spread out throughout bands, of course, Frog Brigade, Primus, and so on. I was shocked to discover that I've had this track twice. Now, I've mentioned before that at the Chicago 2003 show that this track, Diamondback Sturgeon, was cut short because somebody threw something on stage, and let's just stop the song and went on to something else. I was mistaken. It wasn't this track, so I need to dig through that show and find where he castigates the person who threw the thing at him when he stops whatever tune it was. But they played Ol Diamondback Sturgeon and stretched it out over 12 minutes, and it is a wonderful, wonderful track, actually, to extend live. So I got it live in 2003, and of course, I was there in 2015 when they played the entire Pork Soda album. So
yeah, those Fromage performances are really fascinating because they really jammed the song. You know, you mentioned that 12-minute performances. There were some that even reached up to 15 minutes. And it's really cool because you could always tell they were going to do Sturgeon because Tim Alexander would do the drum intro for a while before Lur and Les came in much later. And the middle portion lent itself a lot to improvisation. So those Fromage performances are really, really fascinating to listen to.
Yeah, and it was really great to go back and listen to that one that I thought really didn't exist in its full form, yet this great 12-minute rendition. And Anthony, you pointed out in the on the studio version, it's not incredibly dynamic. They kind of stay in that pocket, but in that Fromage, and I'm sure in other performances, they venture out a teeny tiny bit at least to see where it can take them. That's what I really glommed onto going back to listen to that recording. And then checking out the New Year's Eve one, fairly standard performance if I recall correctly, but it's already been almost 5 years. So I have to go to these live recordings so that I can recall what happened. It's kind of strange what time does to one's memory and one's experiences. I'm not altogether apparently in my head, but I'm trying. Anthony, have you ever caught this one live?
I have. I was at that Frog Brigade New Year's show in 2000. I didn't really listen to the Angels Camp one. I at least I didn't remember. So when they played it, I was like, "Oh my God, this is like." I mean, it's incredibly rare. It's almost like catching a sturgeon in and of itself to have caught it live. But yeah, I remember being like ear to ear grin, just totally blown away and hypnotized because it is a very trancy kind of Tomorrow Never Knows Beatlesy kind of thing. And especially, you know, for a very trippy-esque kind of experience like the Frog Brigade is, it's definitely memorable for that reason.
So you probably got, and I don't know that I've ever listened to that recording, but I'm sure you got extended solos from just about everybody on stage throughout that track. That one probably, I would guess that probably is closer to 18 minutes if that was a showcase track. Yeah,
and it lends itself perfectly for that. Like they can take it, whereas the studio version's doesn't waver too much. Like this is probably like they've been sitting on the song for a while, or Les has, and he's like, you know what, we never really moved it from that original riff, so let's do it. Let's make it the track that we've kind of evolved it into, or wanted it to develop into over the years.
Well, if you've had this track, try to strike up a conversation with a fellow Primus fan, and then when you reference this track, make sure you let them know you got to see it live by saying, "I was there," and that really indicates that you are so proud of this accomplishment of being in the same space and time as this rare track. We have, of course, Primus in the studio, or what passes for a studio. It was a warehouse with their big old live rigs. They put up some rooms. They're listening to each other and watching each other over video monitors. Can you help us, Anthony, theorize how this track came to be? I assume it started with the drum lick, but maybe it didn't.
Yes, if you could visualize, I'm standing here in a Boondock Saint style way of trying to relive the moment and recapture the moment. Since the rooms are very isolated, and this is actually really interesting because this is really like the first time where they're recording it like on their own terms, in their own space. So we can't just like look on a website of what the studio looks like or some other band that has been there. One could speculate, or maybe there has been another band in that warehouse since that might have some pictures, but learning about all the little ISO rooms and everything, that's very fascinating, especially to do it live. That's incredibly difficult to be locked in like that with other musicians when you can't really see them or really vibe with them. Because it's one thing to track everything isolated, like, lay down the drums first and then the guitars and then the bass and vocals, because that's grooving to yourself, or you're grooving with someone else that's recording a scratch track at that time, and then they'll re-record it for reels if it's not a keeper on that first go. So hats off to them. I mean, through the previous Primus tracks where Ron Rigler was in and Matt Weiniger talking about how locked in they were from playing. I mean, this is kind of like putting the blindfold on and cooking up a meal for a chef, or doing it with an arm tied behind the back. So that's incredibly impressive to do that. And as for the sound itself, the drums sound really big through that, but you can kind of hear they're nicely closely mic'd, but it's going through a lot of reverb. So it sounds really big, but the room itself doesn't sound like there's a lot of like immediate early reflections, as we call it, of reverb, where it's like if you're in a bigger room and the very first echoes you hear, that's kind of like the early reflections, and then you get late reflections from the very far reflections, obviously, in the room. Oh. So it's quite a feat, and it sounds very clear and it's very defined. It sounds like they worked out a lot of the supposed drum problems that they had with Seas of Cheese and whatnot, even though I never really thought of it as, a weird sounding drum tone. But, we're our own worst critics, I suppose. So that could be one of the things.
I think so. And that's a good point that these guys are, and they're isolated and we don't know what the room structure was. You're absolutely right. You have this background in sound, and I'd never heard of early reflections before. So that's new territory for me. And that's what I love having sound people on, because they know what your ears are so tuned. What you're hearing. And I largely don't. The layman largely doesn't. That sound on those drums, they do sound big, and we get that descending little drum lick, and you kind of compared it to Tomorrow Never Knows, and it is kind of hypnotic in that way. Starting with those higher tone drums or higher frequency tones, I suppose, and then coming down to the kick. It always got me that kick sounded so big on Sturgeon and not as big on some of the other tracks. That's got to be a conscious recording decision, or where's that coming from, do you think?
They could have moved the microphone placement, or there's a thing that you can do where you build a drum tunnel for your kick drum, and you get like another kick drum or another drum that's, of a fairly deep size. People actually get creative, and I've seen people do it with full-size grand pianos, and they just put a bunch of moving blankets over them. But what you do is you create, like, you're almost extending the drum out, and then you put a microphone at the end. So that can kind of create more of a deeper drum tone. But I don't really think they did that. I think what they did is they just ran the kick through a reverb to make it sound bigger, because you can kind of hear it echo back just a little bit. Or maybe they had just had a really further out room mic, and they just cranked that up. But for real, like, that is a big sound. And until I heard about the individual rooms, I really thought it was like one giant warehouse or one gigantic practice space that they had.
I remember at least the articles about the making of were really specific about those rooms. But for a long time, I just envisioned where they recorded as the warehouse in the Mr. Crinkle video, that they were just kind of 80 yards away from each other going, press play!
Pass the salt.
Yeah. Go.
No, I thought, I envisioned that exact same thing as well, just because that's my only visual reference.
So that drum lick too. Now you have some drumming experience. That drum lick, it pervades the track. But I think, especially during when we get into the verses and so on, Tim is just working really hard. But it does sound like they EQ'd the drums in such a way too that we're getting kind of those ghost notes, or just the hint of a note. And I'm thinking of some of those floor toms or those deeper tone toms. It sounds like he's either just brushing over them, or he hits it and it has such resonance that it just sounds more than one hit. Does that make sense? Yeah.
A lot of it is very well played drums. And I think maybe he's even like putting a little bit of a roll before he really hits the drum. Like, so with his left hand, he's doing a little roll and then hits it with the right. Mm-hmm. Another thing too is, like, it's really interesting if you listen to it really deeply on headphones, or, if you have a really clear enough stereo, you can hear him hitting two different hi-hats, one on his left and one on his right at the very beginning of the riff. So it's like, and then goes into the steady tom roll that goes, descending. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's very clear very well played, and especially to play it for that long without, completely, it's like saying a word over and over and over again until it loses meaning. So if you can do that without, tripping yourself out and start daydreaming about something, that's a lot of attention.
I assume it started with that drum lick, and it had to have started with a jam because this album was largely written in the studio. They did come in with some prepared tracks. We know, of course, Welcome to This World was fully formed, Pressman was fully formed, probably a couple other ones, but this one, it just sounds like it's more solidly structured than some of the other tracks. So maybe this is one that they brought in, having jammed it out backstage or in rehearsals or at some point. Who knows? That's where a lot of this stuff comes from. What's going on with the bass, Anthony? What do you hear in the bass guitar here?
It's very like Middle Eastern, almost like a sitar. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. So that does kind of bring me back into like this Beatlesy psychedelic era. And it's just really nice fretless work on Les's part, and the way he can just kind of doodle around, but every note is with intention. It's not like flagrantly, for lack of a better word, just noodling. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's very well played, and it's definitely adds to the ambiance. And they really locked in, like everything really sits well with itself. Like there's no nothing that doesn't really fit, but it's also nice and spacey. Like they all give each other room to communicate and to do their thing.
I'm going to pick up on the part that you said that it is kind of an understated bass line, especially for what we've come to know from this guy. It's he's not doing a lot of thumping, he's not doing a lot of hard plucking until that solo. And it's very interesting you say Middle Eastern. I never really pictured it like that before, but I can hear those tones. And I don't think I have the language for it, but I hear it in there. It's a lot of those. It depends on what key you're talking about and that sort of thing, but a lot of flatted notes or a lot of notes that are pretty close to each other in tonality. So it does kind of have that Middle Eastern type dissonance. That's fascinating. But it, like I said, understated, and he's sliding a lot on the fretless bass there. So it does sound so mellow to a degree. And I think that plays into the thematic elements of the song, especially when we get into the lyrics.
Yeah. And there's a couple of like little open notes that he'll do, and then he'll be playing underneath it kind of just before it loops back. And that's also another really awesome technique that he kind of throws in a little bit, of a hat nod back into Fish On, I guess.
I have my theories about that. Yes, we're going to be. I think it's more than a. I think it's more than a hat nod. I think it's like wearing its skin. To a degree.
Yes,
we'll get into. I can see. Frankie, what part of this track really strikes you? I'm going to talk about a few things, but what really gets you going with this track?
The vocals, the way they are treated in the studio version, because there's definitely something going on there. And, it's a very evocative track. It really takes you by the hand, so to speak, in regards to the story. It's very well written. What I like about the vocal delivery is that it's kind of flat. So it doesn't really take away much from the music. The music is the centerpiece, and it feels like the lyrics are just a companion, and they are strategically placed in the right spots. It's a perfect example of how Les Claypool doesn't consider himself a singer. Yeah. He regards himself more as a narrator. And I think this song is exactly that. It's a narration. It's a storytelling, but it's done in such an effective way, and the lyrics are placed in such strategic parts of the song that it makes them really compelling. And, as seen on paper, it's an equally compelling story. I think the play on words that he uses, the imagery he conveys with his words is just fantastic. I think it's one of it's certainly, it's not my favorite song on the album, but I think it's one of the best written ones from a lyrical point of view.
Oh, great point. Yeah, it certainly is a standout for a number of reasons. It's just so different from everything else on the record too. I'm going to point to what you said about the lyrical delivery. It is kind of flat, and it's very much couched in the bass line and the drum rhythm. So in that rhythm section, so it doesn't really stand out too much. It's almost like you have to work to pay attention to the lyrics in a way, which is not usually the case in a Primus track. And there's something going on with that delivery of the lyrics. I don't know if he's pretending like he's got a mouthful of chaw, just try if he's going for the old man, spinning the yarn about his fishing story, that sort of thing. Because, you know, if you listen back to it, he's like, you know, that like Hank Hill's dad on that cartoon, you know, like that's the voice I'm thinking of. And it reminded me, I got a couple of friends, they're a number of years older than me, and they're avid fishermen and avid hunters. They go deer hunting, elk hunting every year and that sort of thing. And they always give each other grief when one of them passes up a shot. You know, oh, he had it all sighted in and he let it go. And, but they always say, they always punctuate the other guy passing up a shot by saying, I'd have shot that sumbitch. And that's the first thing I think of when I come back to this vocal delivery. I think about somebody just giving that kind of voice to it. And so to me, it's like a fishing story. You know, that's the delivery, just the old guy in the rocking chair telling this story about this fish. And I don't know if that's the intention, but that's where my mind goes.
Yes. Alternate title, The Young Less in the Sea, written by Hemingway.
I like it. You know, that bass lick too, if we're going to go back and compare it to Fish On, and there's a bunch of reasons we should do that, and I'm going to really talk about that in the lyrical section. Frankie and I really examined Fish On as one of these metaphorical pieces, and it was proven in the liner notes to the re-release of Seas of Cheese and in interviews. You know, the guitar is the fish flipping out all over the place, and, you know, the bass one thing and the drums are something else to create the picture of the fishing experience in Fish On. And I think that's being recreated here. I mean, to me, that understated bass line that just kind of meanders around, I think that's what that sturgeon's doing. It's just zipping around along the bottom there. Just as it says, minding his business. He's just kind of going whichever way, swimming around, seeing what's what. Probably looking for, well, we know what he's looking for. And to me, that's what the bass line is. And then the guitar sound, and Anthony, maybe you can speak to what's going on there, especially during the verses. I don't know if those are air bubbles popping up. If I also picture lily pads for some reason, just that. I'm not sure exactly what Larry's doing. Maybe you can speak to that.
No, but I had that exact vision too. Especially in the visualization of what pork soda would be. The guitar riff is very similar to me of like what carbonated bubbles would sound like going up a bottle. Yeah. So to me, that's the epitome of what a pork soda would be, aside from the tune pork soda, which would be more like a stomach ache from drinking too much Pepsi or something. Yeah, it's just a little diddle, almost like an arpeggio that's going up. And then as he's doing that, he's pushing down on the wah pedal to get more higher frequencies going. And it's this wonderfully timed like sweep of a tone. And again, it's not too crazy. It's not over the top. It allows things to breathe.
It really does. And he's finding the space. And we've talked about that a lot, finding the space. Yeah.
What I think is interesting, you know, now that you're describing the bass as something understated and the guitar, you know, is doing that thing, which is like not, is not really technically complicated, but it's really complementary to the track. Now that you're describing those things, it just came to my mind that this is the third installment from a series. So we have John the Fisherman, we have Fish On, now we have this one, and you know, it's not official, but we could say that The Last Salmon Man is part 4.
I'm counting it.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting that they have never been performed back to back, and Fish On and Sturgeon are huge rarities, while John and Last Salmon Man are certainties for any setlist. So it's quite interesting that even though these pieces are part of a series, they are so rare. It's as if they didn't enjoy playing them to some degree.
And we've theorized with other tracks too, why it's played so much, why it's played so little, why it, you know, that sort of thing. So that this track, it does seem pretty complicated to a degree. And I think I would imagine, you know, looking down the track list, if you're coming in to Primus as a drummer, let's say your name's Brain or your name's Jay, and you see and hear this track and you go, I hope they don't play that one. That would be my reaction. I don't know about those guys. Like if they would just go, hell yeah, let's do it. But this one sounds to me like one I would want to avoid if I could.
Yeah, and again, just kind of doing the repetitive riff a lot might be a reason for that. Or, you know, they're kind of trying to keep it sacred perhaps. Like certain bands will write songs that become a little bit too sentimental, and they don't want to the bubbles to rise to the surface when they're playing. It can become emotional for some people.
It could. Yeah, I think you're onto something there. There is, but we're talking about how understated and atmospheric this track is, and it very much is. But then we get a couple of parts where they let it go, and I'm going to start with the guitar solo. And I think this is really indicative of Larry having to thin out his guitar tone here and there because of what the rhythm section's doing. Because during that solo, Tim is hitting those drums pretty hard, and he's accenting with a lot of really loud cymbals, or really full cymbals, I should say. Not so much loud as they just have such a full sound. And of course, you got Les doing the droning bass part. So he actually is thinning out his guitar tone for that solo. And I think that's purposeful. And it just gives a little more sound, or a little more dynamic sound, I suppose, to the track as opposed to him just running over what Les and Tim are doing. And we're going to hear Larry do that a lot more going forward.
Yeah, and parts of that, because I listened to Punch Bowl first, this song actually kind of reminds me of some of the guitar work on The Tweak Again, but just reversed. On The Tweak Again reminds me of the guitar work from Sturgeon.
Oh, that's a connection I'd never made. Is it particularly in the solo? Because that solo is in Sturgeon here is pretty demented, in terms of what he's doing. And it harkens back to me to Fish On, where he's acting as the fish, or the struggle, with the fish on the line. But there is a lot of action on The Tweak Again too. Is that where you're coming from?
Yeah, not so much like the fast guitar picking, but that wah kind of wow kind of thing, almost like a little Hendrixy, a little like little porno music kind of thing. Nice rock and wah. But it's got that style that he was really in that was his sound. That's always Lara's sound, but like especially in that time period, that was a signature.
There's one other thing I want to mention for me. And that has to do with the part that really gets me going is the drum fill right after the quiet part, just hitting that snare. My God, it just portends to something big coming, right? And that leads into the bass solo, which is the other thing I wanted to talk about. What in the world is going on in that bass solo? We get this great drum fill.
That bass solo is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes, and then that leads us into this solo and Larry's doing that like almost like the mouth harp thing. That's what he sounds like, and he's kind of laying that down so we can get a bass solo over it. So what's going? That's where that really picks up, and then it starts sounding like Les Claypool.
I think that's the payoff if you paid close attention to the first portion of the track.
There aren't that many Les solos out there like that are very defined like that, where it's like, all right, take it. There are like in Tommy or something, that's like a real showcase solo, but this one's kind of like, okay, wow, yes, this is the spotlight slowly ascends onto Les, and he's just doing his thing.
It's hard. I've never really said this before, but about somebody on the bass, but he's shredding. He's shredding on the bass. You never hear that. It's always reserved for the guitar players, but he's really shredding on this one.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's really letting it rip. And then there's those really muted, I don't know if they're, 8th notes, 16th notes, maybe they're 64th notes, but those really muted ones that and it's kind of sounds like the fishing reel when you're clink 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 clink, but when you're really ratcheting it up, I don't know if that's exactly what he was going for or what he envisioned when he was doing that, but that's what it sounds like to me. But he's really, I don't know if he's just muting a note and just letting those fingers fly across the string.
Yeah, no worries.
These high points that you are describing, I think they translate particularly well to live performances, around Fromage and hallucinogenetics. For me, that's when the song was taken to a whole new level. And I don't know if you guys are aware, but there's actually footage on YouTube from a performance in Denver in 2003, courtesy of Toasterland. So you can actually get to see what, for those of us who weren't there, we can get to see what it was like to witness Sturgeon during that tour. Yeah, and I mean, the studio track is great, but during the live performances, all of these high points that you mentioned, I think they were really accentuated by Les in particular during that tour.
Yeah, and as they're building it up, they can really really take it a bit further, but then they really can work the dynamics and like really give a couple of moments of silence because, on an album, you're trying to keep people's attention span most of the time. But yeah, they could really like cut out and, give a couple moments for people to really soak it in and then kind of slowly bring it back up, or, hey, throw in some banter, communicate with the crowd, share fishing stories. Yeah. So I wanted to go back and just real brief, just to not to, move this onto that topic, but the drum line is really similar to like a Rush, like bridge or something. Like Neil would just be kind of like very proggy, just like a little section that would kind of bridge things together.
You know what? And I really think to me, that's where Primus is proggy. Like they'll take these elements of it and then they'll stretch it out or do their own take on it. And that's where I think the progginess comes from. They can just take a slice of it and then turn it into Primus, I guess. That's what it is to me. They're just taking these little elements here and there, and they're not always they really almost never go down the rabbit hole, but they flirt with it.
Yeah. Ooh, also another thing before I forget, I was just pondering, I wonder if the San Rafael practice space, like that warehouse that they did the webcast thing in 98, maybe that's the studio, maybe that's the warehouse that they kind of partitioned into those rooms. So maybe that's the location.
Oh, I wonder if it is. I can't recall off the top of my head if it was a warehouse out that way or if it was in San Francisco proper. I'd have to look at the information. I think the rehearsal space was in the city of San Francisco, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, I need to go and look at the liner notes and see what they mentioned. But yeah, that's my, I don't know, golden egg, white whale kind of thing is for that session is just like, oh, okay, so that's what it looked like.
Yeah. There have to be photos somewhere.
Right. The only thing I could really attest to as to like equipment is I heard it was a Mackie board. So if you see like the one that they probably use for Punch Bowl, it's, this big black board, mainly a live console from what I've heard. Right. So you could probably see that in, old pictures and stuff. Cause I know that Les did a couple of interviews. There's probably, it's probably in the enhanced CD of Punch Bowl when you can do like the 360 tour of, Rancho Relaxo Studios. Let's see what else. As for the reverb, a lot of people were using Yamaha SPX 90s during that time, and I do vaguely remember hearing that was the principal reverb for Tales from the Punch Bowl. So maybe they had acquired that gear already, and as we've heard a lot, that this was their first dive head first into ADATs and then in the digital realm,
right? Which
was quite controversial for its time because a lot of people just swore by tape, and it still is tape technically, but it doesn't have that same sound. But by today's standards, it's all zeros and ones for the most part. It just depends on how well you can convert the analog sound into the digital sound. So that's while everything now is kind of zeros and ones, it's how well it's translated into zeros and ones. So not all binary is created equal, as they say, or I say, but I'm no, I am no ends to a means at the last stop. I don't know what the right term is, but yes.
Fair enough. Yeah, the only photos in the Jay Blakesberg book are at Les's house during that time when they recorded some of the Pork Soda tracks there. So we don't have any, official photos that are probably publicly released of that rehearsal space during the recording time. So one of these days.
One of these days.
Let's talk lyrics. Man, here's the reason why I say that this track is wearing fish on skin, and not because I like psycho movies. The idea is when you hear the lyric, the Ol Diamondback Sturgeon came swimming along. By the way, love that line. Rootin' and sniffing and urging to spawn. Well, you got to say it right. Rootin' and sniffing and urging to spawn. So But then he says, in the mud flats of San Pablo Bay. And I'm so sorry, Frankie. He says San Pablo again. That's not how you pronounce that word or that name. But he says that, and then that takes me right back to Fish On. Dad, me, and Daryl, we were fishing, and they caught a 100-pound sturgeon on a 20-pound test. Hello? This is the other side, okay? This is the wolf's account of the Three Little Pigs. That's what this is. This is the sturgeon side of the story to me. So this is a great companion piece to fish on, because to me, this is that fish. So we're getting to see what the fish's experience was that day when Dad caught him on the really small test there. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in the lyrics. You kind of have your standard A, B, C, B rhyme scheme, but I kind of like that he's doing kind of an 11/8 for the syllable count with some variations. It'll be 12/7, 11/7, 12/8 here and there as far as the number of syllables goes, but it's mostly an 11/8. So if you read or listen to the first line and then the second line, you're getting more syllables in the first line of each couplet. The other thing is in the liner notes in the lyric book, I love the quotation marks around the word tugging, because the fish doesn't know what's going on the human side, right? Other than this thing in his mouth is pulling him around and his flight response is kicked into overdrive. He's trying to get away from it. So, as you say, Frankie, this creates this atmosphere and the lyrics really create this story, and he does have this way with words, and this is one of them. And just putting tugging in the quotation marks really does it for me, because we're in the mindset of this fish that's just got to get away. Really cool thing right there. And the last thing I want to say about the lyrics that hasn't already been mentioned, as far as, Frankie, you broke it down pretty well already, but I do appreciate that this track breaks the trend that was being set up in the first few tracks on this album of, as far as the verses goes, of coming back around to the first verse and the last verse and doing a variation on it. Because this is a linear story, and we get linear storytelling, as you said, Frankie. I don't mind the reprise of the first line at the last as the track fades out, because it's a fishing story. And as you know, gentlemen, you tell fishing stories over and over and over again. So the repetition actually bears some weight here and makes sense. It's almost like it was intentionally put there to show this as here's old Gramps telling the story again.
Very much. It's a worthy tale, and yeah, it's one of those twists of a movie where you see a movie in one perspective and then you see it in the other one. And God, if I can remember that movie that's got Forrest Whitaker, and it's about like a bombing in Spain, and then they see it from the different vantage point. It's like Vantage Point, but with fish in the aquatic.
Right, yeah. And I haven't seen Vantage Point, but a lot of those where you're seeing the story from different perspectives goes right back to Rashomon. That's kind of the device there, that old story. And a lot of TV shows and movies will do their take on that, yeah. And to a degree, if you put Fish On and this one together, you're getting that kind of, sort of. But it is cool to hear from the fish's perspective of what's going on. And the fish's experience, because we don't often think of the fish's experience. This is not going to turn me into a vegetarian or anything, but it is, this is that experience of the other side.
Right. And, speaking about the lyrics and going back to the fact that this is part of a series, I mean, it's interesting to consider that we have John the Fisherman, which basically introduces, Les Claypool's interest in the activity. And then we have Fish On, which is based on a real life experience. Then we have Sturgeon, which is the other side of the story, is the perspective of the fish. And then many years later, we have The Last Salmon Man, where, basically the resources are depleted. And that song paints a pretty bleak picture. So it makes you wonder if there's ever going to be a part 5 to this series, considering how bleak Last Salmon Man is.
Not something I'd considered. I, of course, would welcome with open arms a part 5, but you're right. It is a bleak picture. So where do you go from there if you're making this some kind of thematic linear story from the first one to the fourth one? Yeah, I don't know where you go.
Well, if you're a Primus purist, you're gonna hate what I'm about to say, because it's like Star Wars. Perhaps what I'm about to say is not canon, but if you if you think about it, of course it's not official, but if you think about it, perhaps of Whales and Woe, the title track from that album, and also Little Fishes from the Claypool Lennon Delirium second album, could be part of the Fisherman Chronicles. I'm sorry if any Primus purist hates the idea, but after all, they're fishing tracks.
I quit. You guys finish this. This is dumb. Bye. I have a couple of live tracks. I brought the live tracks today. Frankie, I'm picking up your slack. Guy doesn't do anything around here except say controversial things. So this this first one, I'm just going to play a portion from the Ol Diamondback Sturgeon performance in 2003 at the Chicago Aragon Ballroom because I was there, but mostly because it's a good trip down memory lane for me. But this portion in particular is quite nice. So I wanted to play that particular part because, one, Larry hits a bunch of sour notes. It sounds funny, but he also is leaning into that trilling and that those seconds, I guess, the notes right next to each other, and that's what Les is doing a lot of. So there's some parallel stuff going on there, but it just right after that verse, they just hit it all together, and it just pounds there. It's so cool.
Yeah, that's a fantastic build-up, and it's really laid back in that sense too. Like you can hear it in Les's voice how he's very just grooving with it, and it's not too busy, it's not too strained. It's for as busy as it is in with the drums and everything, it's still really laid back. It's got the happy-go-lucky groove.
It really does.
The drumming is terrific on that version. It's really remarkable, and I think a lot of bands or a lot of artists find it really hard to top some of their studio recordings when they perform live. But with Primus, I think this song is a great example of how, they can make any live rendition so much better than a studio track. I love that version so much more than the studio version.
I'm going to play something else for you guys, and it just so happens to be a show I was at. This is New Year's Eve 2015. Here's a little snippet of what it sounded like the last time we heard this track live. This is an audience recording, by the way, so the quality is surprisingly good. Oh, that's nice. That drum fill gets me every time, man.
Is that the recording where people keep talking over the song during the first portion? Like they're discussing how many New Year's Eve concerts they've seen?
It's quite possible. This is from, and you can find it on YouTube. It's Primus 12/31/15 Pork Soda in entirety. I just went to that part because that's what gets me every time. I love that drum intro into the solo.
Yeah, that gets people pumped.
It makes you wonder why they don't play the song more often, because they really have it nailed down.
Yeah. When we discussed it with Bob, maybe it's just so down-tempo and so mellow that they feel like it's going to derail the show. I don't know. I can agree I can agree with that in principle, but at the same time, it's a rarity, so I want to hear it, and I would enjoy the hell out of it. And I have, because I was there. Frankie, you have one for us from...
Yeah, I'd like to play to you guys favorite live rendition of Sturgeon ever. It's from Penn's Landing in Philadelphia. This is Tour de Fromage 2004. And it's a really performance because if you've heard this show, you know that this is a unique rendition of Sturgeon sandwiched between Tommy the Cat.
That's about it, Frankie?
Yep, that's it.
That is a rad transition because it's almost like he's doing this slapping and popping thing, but then he's slowly, very slowly, getting, I should say, I can't talk right now. He's very slowly backing off of the slapping and popping and then just doing the regular finger picking and the sliding to lead into that riff. How cool is that?
Yeah, it's really seamless. I'm sure nobody saw that track coming in the middle of Tommy the Cat. The transition is perfect. The bass work is absolutely stunning. That's my favorite rendition of Sturgeon ever. I think it's just musicianship at its finest.
Anthony, what do you think of that?
Yeah, that was cool. I didn't know how he was going to connect the dots on that one, but he did it. It was very well done with really nice intention. And yeah, as he was doing it, it's like, oh, I don't know how he's going to get on the off ramp. No one's letting him in. And then he managed to go through those cars like a gazelle.
And in case people are wondering, it's not a straightforward rendition of Sturgeon. It's actually, it actually goes on for 10 minutes. And then it goes back to Tommy the Cat. So it's a tour de force. It's a 16-minute epic.
Right, yeah. My track length says 14:39, and there's probably a little bit on either end. The other tracks for that soundboard, too.
I think Josh should give the non-canon saga a chance at some point.
We'll do a special Patreon episode where I do live commentary, listening to the tracks back to back to back to back to back to back. And it'll just really be a litany of complaints because that's what I like to do. It sounds fun. Ol Diamondback Sturgeon, I'm going to put you in the cooler because you've been tracked. I don't even know if you eat sturgeon. I suppose you could. Thanks for listening, everybody. We had a great time. Anthony, thanks again for talking to us, talking Primus with us. What a great time.
Oh, man. Thanks so much for having me. This is always a blast.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
We are at Primus Tracks on Instagram and Twitter. Frankie is at Frankie Berestein. Anthony is, he doesn't hang out on the internet. He actually has a life. And if you want to support the podcast, you can drop us a couple bucks at my email address, smashysmashy@gmail.com. If you send me $3, I'll send you a couple beautiful Primus Tracks stickers that Frankie designed and the wonderful people at Sticker Robot printed for us. If you send me $5, I'll send you 4. Send me $10, I'll send you 9 stickers. Those stickers, by the way, help the proceeds go straight to our server costs so that we can keep this thing going in perpetuity, or at least for a number of years. So thank you, everybody who's supported us so far, and we're going to keep making these things into the horizon here. Later days.
Willie Mays.
The old Diamondback Sturgeon came swimming along.